SpaceX, an update in general. Kind of a funny question to ask, but what business do you think SpaceX is in? Most people tend to think of it as a launch business, and that was certainly true. They build rockets. Although, strictly speaking, they build launch as a service. They don't really sell that many rockets. They're not really a rocket selling company. They're really a service selling company. They sell you the service of transportation, and they're providing it. They kind of have to do that because they're reusing their rockets. So they don't want to really sell you one. They want to sell you the service so they can keep reusing it. But on the other hand, they have the Starlink project, which is satellite-based internet. I picked a couple of pictures just to represent this. On the right, you have Starlink. This is a phase one where there are 1,500 satellites crisscrossing, basically covering every spot on Earth. That's only phase one. Right now, there's well over 6,000 satellites, like 6,400 something. So it's a lot denser than that, but there are different shells at different altitudes and so on. But that's a good symbol of what does Starlink look like and do. And then over here, you have the rockets business, but here you're emphasizing the fact that it's a service, and the reason that they're so successful is they're reusing their boosters, and they're landing them on drone ships typically. So there's the two main parts of the SpaceX business. It just so happens that right now, the revenue coming out of Starlink has now passed the revenue coming out of the launch business. And there's also what's called positive free cash flow, meaning are you making or losing money on the operations, even after accounting for the fact you're spending a lot of capital expense, meaning you're buying a lot of equipment and machinery and so on. Even accounting for that, they're actually starting to get cash flow coming back out of it now. And this is the first year that's been true. Now, this is actually all per plan. Musk said this years ago that the launch business isn't really big enough. We want to go to Mars. How do we pay to go to Mars? Well, the way we pay for it is we do some other stuff. Well, they did Starlink. It's hard to tell because, it's a private company. But really, they make so much money from the launches that they could afford to get through the initial cost of building Starlink, which is huge. And it's been like a $10 billion project. And you had to get that cash from somewhere. Well, they got that out of being the most successful rocket launcher. But now that Starlink has gotten past the kickoff point where it's actually running and making money, now it can start throwing cash back and start paying for Starship and all the stuff that's needed to go to Mars. And this was all exactly as laid out by Musk early on.
We'll give a quick overview of Starlink's status before getting back to the recent developments in the launch business. Starlink has 6,426 satellites as of September 2024. Of those, 6,371 are working, and they have about 4 million subscribers and are growing fast. The graphic here shows the areas with the agreements to provide service. That goes on a country-by-country basis.
The bright areas there are the areas that are using it. It's still relatively expensive. In the US, it'd be like $120 a month for broadband service. And that's why you see the developed world mostly has it, and places here and there, usually where they're out without good infrastructure.
That's always been their market, places where it would cost a lot of money to put in fiber optic infrastructure. There have been developments in Starlink's direct-to-cell services. That allows ordinary T-Mobile and other cell phones to communicate directly via satellite instead of ground-based cell phone towers. The satellites for good initial service weren't all in place, but because of the destruction of recent hurricanes Helene and Milton, the FCC has granted temporary clearance to offer free service in hard-hit areas such as North Carolina. This includes emergency alerts and likely some texting. Apple has offered similar service. Both are reportedly slow and intermittent for now, but better than nothing. Starlink is also offering temporary free broadband service to those same areas, but the catch is that someone still has to buy the hardware, which costs $349. Both FEMA and the Space Force have been deploying the hardware and the service for emergency communications. There's some irony here. The FCC rejected an $880 million rural broadband subsidy to Starlink in December 2023 and earlier. They said that Starlink failed to demonstrate that it could deliver the promised service by December 2025. Two of the dissenting FCC members protested that this denial was based on political motives, not technical. So far, Starlink is the only one of that group that can provide any high-speed service with low time delay. This presentation was made just before the Starship Integrated Flight Test 5. We'll report on that test in a different video. The bread and butter SpaceX launch business is the Falcon 9 series. That also includes the Falcon Heavy. It has had some issues lately. The Falcon 9s were grounded by the FAA 3 times in the last 3 months.
Previously, back in July, there had been an upper stage failure, and then there was a bad landing of a booster. It just collapsed. Probably the legs just weren't good enough because the thing was too old. It had already been up there like 21 times or something. But this latest one, the upper stage, it had a misfire. The engine didn't fire when it was supposed to. This was during the mission to deliver astronauts to the space station. The 2 astronauts, not 4, because they're leaving empty seats for return next February, or the 2 that got stranded up there by the Starliner stuff. And so they delivered them, but it was really just the return of that stage. It didn't go back and land in the ocean where it was supposed to. It missed. So that was enough to flag it. Those are all legitimate kind of things. Those are the kind of things the FAA ought to be worrying about, is why didn't things work as they were supposed to? By the way, they just cleared that. I just saw that this morning. They cleared it, I guess, yesterday. So they're back in business now. It turns out they probably didn't miss that many launches because the 2 that are of immediate concern, well, one wasn't monitored by the FAA, and the other one didn't have a second stage coming back to Earth, so this didn't apply. But there is a lot of scuffling going on right now between SpaceX and the various regulatory agencies, the FAA and the EPA. They're making 2 basic claims. One is that there's absurd environmental fines going on, and we talked about this last time. For instance, spilling liquid oxygen in the launch site, that one was just insane. Basically, the oxygen, which was originally distilled out of the atmosphere, went back to the atmosphere. And this is not pollution in any way. Clearly, it was something else, but it had nothing to do with pollution. You might argue that it's an OSHA violation of some sort. There's an increased risk of explosion in a high oxygen environment. But even that, the Atlas V's, they pour out hydrogen when they're at launch. So that's an even much worse problem. And no one's ever been bothered by that before. And the other one is about the water deluge system, which dampens all the heat and vibration at the initial launch. That's basically drinking water, and they're being accused of industrial pollution. Now,
At this point, one person in the audience objected to using the word absurd, which was a quote from Elon Musk originally. Her concern was that the water would pick up dangerous chemicals and trash, damaging sensitive wetlands.
yeah, and I was about to say that that's more like a 90% kind of thing in my mind. It's not good. But, well, and let's go back to where these things came from. Basically, they're saying this is industrial wastewater. And it's a real concern. If you're at a refinery or a chemical plant and you get a water leak somewhere, I mean, there are a lot of toxic hazardous chemicals around there, depending on what went wrong. If you had a leak in the heat exchanger or something where you got really bad chemicals mixed in, there aren't those bad chemicals here. It is just drinking water. It's not any different than rain.
I'd like to acknowledge that because, sure, drinking water is fine. But whenever you take a bunch of drinking water, and we're talking about swimming pools full of water, gallons and gallons of water, and you push them across a launch pad, you're going to pick up those chemicals you're talking about, the oil and all the other chemicals that are on the launch pad, and push them into the protected wetlands. And that's where the problem comes.
Well, first of all, the amount of water is a lot less than a good heavy rainstorm. So this is no worse than a rainstorm, which happens all the time, including right there. No, I mean, you're talking a couple swimming pools, yes.
Should the EPA fine you? Should the EPA fine you when it rains and water comes out of your driveway and pours into the drainage system on the street? Because I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
No, I totally disagree. You're taking a swimming pool or 2 worth of water, you're forcing it across a place that has, a flight line that has oil and other chemicals on it into an environmental wetland. Well, then why is the rebar showing up?
Oil. There's no oil. This is methane fuel. It's only a liquid because it's chilled to minus 260 degrees.
So none of the hydraulics on the test stands have oil on them. None of the cars that are driving up to the launch site have oil or leak
there's
gasoline.
Almost no oil. Well, there's certainly nothing fuel related. I mean, everything there is a gas and atmospheric pressure. There has to be a little bit of oil here and there. Even the hydraulics, that is part of the design of Starship, is they're trying to avoid anything that they can't get in Mars. They can pull out methane, and I think...
So I live by White Oak Bayou. I live in a subdivision, so every time it rains, there's going to be runoff, and that runoff is going to run into the street, then run into the drains, and from the drains, it's going to run into White Oak Bayou, or the park right there around 43rd Street. And that means that my entire subdivision would have to be shut down as a polluting site because there are cars that drive up and down the street. There are the driveways. There's oil, a little bit of gas. drains on the street. I mean, there are city trucks. I passed 6 city trucks pouring sidewalks in my neighborhood coming here on the way. And so it's like the city will have to stop building sidewalks in my subdivision because it's a pollution hazard the next time it rains.
Wow, you have
I
sidewalks?
think, pardon me?
You have sidewalks? Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's a great deal. It's a big deal. But it's like, I think there's a question of degree that has to be addressed here. And then there's the notion of like, let's talk about Deer Park for a few moments and what's going on over there. And you're worried about, and we're worried about drinking water, which is even better quality, I think, in a way,
Well-
than rainwater. And, you know, I mean, there's degrees of severity here. And I think the notion that the Starship water deluge system is real bad, it's like, compared to what? I mean, there are wetlands over in the Deer Park area. There's 2 or 3 bayous over there. And it's like, why is the legal whip being applied here and not over to Deer Park or not even to my housing subdivision?
Yeah.
We're going to agree to disagree. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little selective.
Well, I mean, I think you're a little bit quick to dismiss Jules's point, right? Because it's sort of like the difference between having like rain fall on the deck, and kind of run away versus like putting like some type of protective stuff on your deck and then power washing it, which is like pushing those chemicals, so you have like all these things that have been done to the pad to protect it from the flames of the rocket. Is that material
And they got
being
licenses for that, for the DCEU,
Sure.
and from the federal government.
But-
Yeah, it's basically concrete. I mean, it's a fancy concrete.
Yeah.
I don't think it actually has a coating because almost no coating would stand up to that kind of rocket exhaust anyway.
Yeah,
it's
but-
pretty much solid.
But I think in terms of looking at, people say, pure drinking water coming out of the deluge system, I mean, it is any materials that are at that launch site are now being pushed out away from that in a much different way than, say, regular rainwater.
In my
How is it different?
environment, when I wash my car in my driveway with city water, if I'm using city water and I'm washing my car,
Mhm.
that runs down my driveway
Sure.
into the city drainage system
Right.
right there, and it runs 6 blocks west
Sure.
over to White Oak Bayou, and it dumps into there, and they've got little turtles and little frogs living there, because I've seen them. And I've seen a lot of other people washing cars in my neighborhood, and the little turtles and the little fish and all that, they seem to be doing just fine.
I think it's a difference between personal and industrial scale. So, like, you washing your car is one thing, but if a car wash that serviced a whole bunch of fleets of cars opened right next to it and regularly power washed all of their crud into that one bayou.
There are 3 car washes in my subdivision, around the edges of my subdivision, and they are doing exactly.
Okay, and
This is an extremely exciting topic
Yes.
to discuss.
Yeah.
So I can see us having a whole
Yeah.
meeting just
Those
on
two,
this.
we probably
which
can't stay
kinda
on that.
need.
Well, we'll agree to disagree. Anyway, I'll stick with absurd. I agree that, okay, it's only 90% absurd in the case of the water. But anyway. Okay, the second claim is simply regulatory overreach, and that's that should they be regulating all this stuff, like changing the launch control center or finding a new storage tank? This is really a case where the company interests are exactly aligned with the people's in that they want success. And so what they're just basically saying is there's just too much red tape. And of course, I realize everybody always says that when they don't like the results, but I think they have a point here that it's not the same as the normal industry when you get down to it. Okay, next thing is, this came up last meeting actually, launching 5 Starships to Mars. I had just heard about the launching of a Starship. Somebody in the audience had already seen that it was 5, and it turned out, that's true. They still haven't really said what's going to be in those. But what this is all about, keep in mind, there's only a launch window every 26 months, roughly every 2 years. But what does that really mean? That's on the assumption that you're doing what's called a Hohmann transfer, which is something that's illustrated in this diagram down here, where you're showing the Earth orbit and Mars orbit. And there's a period where if you launch at just the right time from Earth, you can actually intersect where Mars is going to be at that point. And you do that by having one big burst out of Earth orbit, and that's the one down here near the bottom. And then you have another burst of thrust up here at the top. Basically, the first one throws you out of Earth orbit into an elliptical orbit, which would eventually come back, except that up at the second point here, you have another burst of velocity, and then you match the Mars orbit, and then from there you go ahead and land. You're basically coasting that entire period. It's like a 9-month period, independent of the size of the rocket or anything. So, okay, you only get a chance to test this stuff every 2 years. If you have to wait 2 years between tests, it'll take you forever to get there. SpaceX never really explained why 5. My guess is, well, the biggest question is, can they do successful landings there? Well, if you get 5 tries, well, maybe they'll be in orbit, and maybe what they'll do is they'll land one, and if they see that didn't work well, they'll change the software and the control program to try something else. They really have not explained this, why 5, but it seems like a logical thing. If you only can run a test every 2 years, do as much as you can in that period. So they've said they want to test, can they land? That's the first. Because it's not the same as landing on Earth. It's not the same as landing on the moon, where there's less gravity and no atmosphere. You've got some atmosphere, so it's a little bit different. The gravity is in between, and the atmosphere is a little bit there. So the idea is you send unmanned ones, and then eventually, if that works out, you send a crew in one of the following cycles. Now, the goal, this seems pretty unlikely to be achieved, but the goal is to try to keep in everybody's mind is something self-sustaining in, say, 20 years. I'm not sure many people actually believe that's going to happen, but it's good to have audacious goals. That's what it comes down to.
We don't know what the payloads will be, but they can't be too expensive because there's a higher than usual probability of a crash. But it would be a shame if we didn't include some payloads that will provide knowledge about Mars.
Okay, just some miscellaneous topics. We talked about the fact that because the Boeing Starliner had failed and so they had to send it back without astronauts, they sent up the next mission with 2 empty seats so that they can finally return when that craft comes back in February. Some other things, the Chinese are starting to put up their mega constellations, like the equivalents of the SpaceX stuff. And what they found from the first few that have started going up is they're a whole lot brighter than the American ones. So their astronomers are getting pretty alarmed about that. It's not clear what to do about that. Well, there have been complaints, but we'll see what they do. At least SpaceX made efforts to cut back on it. Next topic was a quick one. Vulcan Centaur, which was a new rocket, its second launch succeeded almost, in that it actually got the payload, well, dummy mass payload. It was really running it for certification purposes. But actually, the solid rocket booster, one of its nozzles blew off, so it didn't work as well as it should have. The one interesting one that just came up is China just landed its first reusable satellite. It's about a 7,000-pound satellite, of which 1,300 pounds is payload. Some American companies have already done this, like Varda, we've talked about in the past, where you send up something that's basically a satellite where you manufacture something, typically crystals or something, where you can do it in microgravity and it's much higher purity, fewer defects and that sort of thing, and you bring it back. And so the Chinese are now doing this kind of thing too. This is their first time they've done this. They were doing a lot of experiments. They're breeding plants and doing various science experiments. They weren't that explicit on what they're actually doing. Yeah, it's reusable. It's a reusable satellite, as are the Varda satellites. And that's a new thing. Basically, when you get to space manufacturing, people think, oh, we're going to go up and do it in a space station. That's incredibly inefficient because there's all this handling of landing at the space station, handing it off to people, installing it, people taking it, and then taking the products and sending it back. It's a lot simpler just to send it up in the self-contained vehicle, do whatever it needs to do, and bring it back, and reusing the satellite. You're paying the same amount for launch mass. It's just that it's a whole lot more efficient. So that's most likely the future of manufacturing in space. The lab experiments will be done on space stations, but manufacturing is probably going to be more this way. It's all going to be for really high value stuff. You're not going to make steel. You're going to make stuff that costs thousands of dollars a pound. But anyway, Chinese are getting in on that too. I think that's it. Okay, just upcoming launches. Europa Clipper, momentarily probably. The rest of them are all the same as last time. Blue Origin's about to launch their big rocket. Flight Test 5 originally had been delayed until November. It might happen tomorrow, but it's pending at final FAA approval. Everything is going ahead as if the launch is going to happen, but as I heard even this morning, there hasn't been any official approval yet. So that was held up. And its big things are catching the booster at the launch site and also basically much better thermal protection. Oh, okay, so it's probably going to happen tomorrow then. Anyway, another lunar South Pole mission by Intuitive Machines in January. Dream Chaser, which is another way to get to basically a space plane, getting it to and from the space station, to be determined. I think that's it.
Other space-related videos or slide presentations by me are available at the link shown here. That includes a list of videos at my YouTube channel, so you can view them or subscribe for notifications about future videos. These presentations are mostly made as part of the meetings of the National Space Society's North Houston chapter, and the link to that is shown. Topics like these are presented as part of a monthly news segment, and there are also lots of other interesting speakers and open discussions. You can attend in person or online via Zoom. Come join us.